Once again, welcome everyone for joining us this morning for our sustainability session number 5. And we are extremely pleased to be joined today by Dr. Gillian Armstrong, who will talk to us a little bit about especially commercial office space adaptive reuse. I do want to make sure that we acknowledge that the ASBN thrives here on Ghana land, and also hosting this session from Ghana land, which is also known as Adelaide, South Australia. We would like to pay our respects to our Aboriginal communities, past, present, and emerging, and of course, make sure that we very much respect and recognize their connection to land and also to country. And we'd also like to take this opportunity to also have invite the rest of our community here on the chat today to have the opportunity to also think about ways in which we positively affect our ecological communities as well as our human communities through the built environment. But on that note, our sustainability sessions are really aimed to be these opportunities to either be inspired, hear about some new ideas around sustainability, sustainable design, regenerative design, but also an opportunity to hear from some experts. And this time we get to hear from Gill, who has recently completed her PhD and has also had her research published in Cities, which is one of the most prominent journals for built environment research. So we're very thrilled to actually have this opportunity to have Gill on the call with us today and share a bit about her research. To start off, of course, we always want to make sure that we do a little cheers to everyone. So if you do got a cup, and you don't have to have it on the video, but cheers, y'all. Get some of this matcha caffeine hit. Delicious. And once you have that little bit of joy in your life, I'd just like to quickly introduce Gill first before we let her do a quick presentation to us, and then we'll kind of open up all to questions. So if you could please make sure you keep yourself on mute until the Gill has finished her presentation. And if you don't want to, of course, there's always the opportunity to pop your questions in the chat, which myself, also Yaara, Plaves, who is on the call, will be monitoring those and making sure that we guide the discussion into our very, very fun Q&A session. So right on. So Gill Armstrong, her expertise and also passion really advocates for the transitioning the buildings we already have to new purposes and markets. Her latest research has developed a new method to quantify and visualize vacancy types in office building populations. And this particular analysis is used to evaluate potential urban strategies to pump new life into quieted CBDs. Obviously, very relevant research to especially what we went through with COVID last year. Gill enjoys working across built environment disciplines, architecture, planning, construction, real estate, and also policymaking. She's also worked across LGAs and state government, across SA and in Victoria. And she also was a practicing architect in the UK and is also currently lecturing at RMIT and at UTS. So everyone, if there are reactions, so you can put a little bit of a clap emoji somewhere in there if you'd like. But please welcome Gill.
Right. First of all, thanks for coming along. Before I start, I really wanted to say thanks to Ken and all at ASBN. You guys have supported my research throughout, from sharing my early thoughts with experts in the network, but also helping me do some data collection. So thanks very much for supporting the research throughout its journey. And also thanks to Adelaide City Council and also professional bodies such as the RICS, who really enabled the research throughout. The title of my presentation is called The Adaptive Reuse Predicament, and it's not a phrase that's coined by me, but it's a term that I found in the public debate. My study, the whole PhD, has 4 different research methods, both qualitative and quant data, and each of the method added a new layer of understanding about what this predicament actually is. Overall, the research reports that building regulation is not a technical barrier to adaptive reuse of vacant office buildings in Adelaide CBD. But at the start of the journey, I really didn't expect to report this negative result. I thought I was going to find out, which aspects of code were problematic. So what I ask of you today is to be really critical when forming your own opinions and voicing those opinions, especially when you're contributing to discussions on adaptive reuse and things like regulation. I'm asking you to always think, what is the evidence for my opinion? And is my opinion objective, or does it contain bias? The presentation that I'm going to talk about today is an outline of my whole study. I'll give you a whistle-stop tour. And it's also about my article, which Ken mentioned. It was published last Sunday in Cities Journal, which I'm really pleased about, maybe really well timed for this presentation. Both are free to access at the moment, and the 2 links I'm hoping to someone will pop in the chat for me, so you can grab those links to the paper and the PhD report. But today I'm going to talk about how vacancy can impact in urban centres. I'm going to touch on the policy context for adaptive reuse, and then I'm going to unpick what the adaptive reuse predicament is presented by asking, what is the problem represented? And finally, I'm going to talk about my method on vacancy and some findings at the end. Okay, so the impacts of vacancy really play out at different building environment scales, from the single building up to communities of buildings to city and regional scales. And so, to be brief, vacancy can impact the city in many different ways, including when we have too much vacancy or even too little. When we have too little, we have really tight markets, and we also have quite a lot of community displacement. So at the moment, Adelaide is reporting back in February this year of around 16% vacancy in office buildings by the Property Council's figures. And also I note that 40% of this vacancy is in the older grade buildings. Now, if you flip that thinking, that 40% sounds high, but 60% really in primary grade buildings, premium A and B grade buildings, that's quite a significant amount of vacancies, 16%. And if you consider now we've got 83 Perry Street being constructed, that's approximately 30,000 square metres that will be coming online as a premium grade building. Okay. So I'll move on to a little bit of theory. And the sinking stack theory is a prevalent notion in real estate practice. And new construction is thought to enter the market at the premium quality grades. And then, as the theory goes, that as the building ages, it sinks through the quality grades until it's no longer wanted or obsolete. And there's lots of processes behind that can speed it up or slow it down. There's also a notion that as the building sinks through the grades, vacancy becomes harder to fill. So these are the theories that we see in public debate, but with all theory, those theories are quite a simplistic notion, and they also need testing over time to see if they're still relevant. But no one really is that interested in doing research on old, decrepit, non-heritage buildings that no one really values, right? But if we want sustainable cities, these are the buildings that make up the most amount of our building stock. These are the very buildings that we need to be targeting. So what do we know about vacancy? We definitely know that maybe this theory is a little bit out of date, but we do know that vacancy is a precursor to premature obsolescence if we don't take any action to keep the quality of those buildings high. Now, just a little bit of a summary to keep you up to speed with what's been happening recently in research. Here we've got Kevin Muldoon and Greenhill's research in 2017, which looked at office buildings, secondary grade office buildings in regional cities, similar to Adelaide across the UK. And you notice here that adaptive reuse is just one intervention amongst a plethora of different strategies that building owners can use. And adaptive reuse is considered to be a medium to high intensity activity, depending on the quality of the building, its age, and also the compatibility of the new use. Now, the wide range of interventions is interesting because these interventions can reverse a building's trajectory through the sinking stack. It can avoid premature obsolescence, make the building last a lot longer and be more valuable to the community. So our understanding of where vacancy is located in buildings across the city can help us make sustainable decisions and evaluate which intervention is suitable for each building and also as a policy option for urban regen across the city. Now, simplistic vacancy rate averages are out there in the news, but a single bold figure of vacancy across a city of a wide variety of different buildings within a population just can't offer the necessary insight we need for sustainable policy making. We need to know which buildings are empty, not just the average. We need to know where that vacancy is sitting, and are there any patterns that could hint at the reasons for that vacancy. We also could look at what policy mechanisms are available to encourage the curation of different use needs to meet different demand and stimulate vibrancy. And how does adaptive reuse figure in all this? You know, it's only one method that we've got at hand. So there's a body of postdoctoral research about vacancy that's been happening over the last 10 years, not a huge amount, but it's certainly there and strong. From my own work in 2020 to Kevin Muldoon-Smith in 2016, Sarah Wilkinson at UTS in 2012, and Hilde Roemoy is a big research powerhouse in the Netherlands looking at vacancy. Her PhD is from 2010. And for Adelaide, we've also got David Ness's study on office building oversupply, and it's nearly 20 years old now, but it's still really relevant. Now, vacancy appears when there's a gap between the expectations of end users and the quality of the building. Or sometimes it appears from low demand and low economic activity, or as we've seen recently, from societal and technological shifts. So working from home is one such recent shift, and we just don't know how permanent that shift will be yet. Now, the causes of vacancy are wide-ranging as well, as the categories show here. We've got technological barriers, political, economic, sociological. And when my research focuses really down on the technological and legal barriers that were being claimed. But while we know there's a lot of problems with what's driving vacancy, there's a very little critical analysis of stakeholders' views and their inherent biases when vacancy drivers are being reported. That's why at the beginning I ask you to be really critical of where your opinions are from. What's your evidence when you're thinking about adaptive reuse? Okay, I'll move to policy on vacancy and adaptive reuse a little bit now. So this slide charts the policy context for adaptive reuse in SA. These policies represent the framework which advocate for greater adaptive reuse. And you can see, where are we? Over here, we've got local government policies that have been really influential. Postcode 3000 from Melbourne, that really lit the interest in regeneration through adaptive reuse on a city scale, particularly of non-heritage buildings. And recently we've got SA's state planning policy 03, adaptive reuse. So things are being developed at local levels, at state levels, and also internationally we've got Adaptive reuse is associated with urban resilience, and this, of course, is one of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, SDG number 11. So that's the policy context around adaptive reuse, and it's really strong. Some of those policies don't really have much mechanisms in there to measure how effective those policies are, but there's definitely some good policy positioning. So now on to Adelaide, and moving from the policy positioning to the public debate. This really familiar view of Adelaide looking eastwards across the CBD, and this quote here at the bottom really encapsulates the problem of vacancy and how it was tied to building regulation and adaptive reuse being positioned as the best solution. So we need to solve our adaptive reuse predicament. This means we need to start bulldozing development and building code barriers, preventing the transition from aging commercial buildings to prime multi-residential stock. Now, this quote was taken from the Advertiser in 2015 in the lead up to the election, and you can probably see elements of the sinking stack theory here in this quote. Okay. During the lead up to that state election, both ends of the political spectrum were cited. They all claimed that there was a real strong need for building regulation reform to address vacancy, and who can blame them? It's an often repeated mantra. Even in academic research, it's repeated. But what is missing is the underlying evidence to support the just descriptive reporting of what stakeholders are claiming. And then sadly, the world saw what the bonfire of regulations really looks like in reality, with the avoidable events at Grenfell Tower in 2017, wholly connected to compliance of building regulation. What happens when we take our eye off compliance? And suddenly calls to relax regulation halted in Adelaide around this time, and I suspect around the world. Now, the Minister's Code for upgrading existing buildings was also being developed at this time. This is a piece of policy, and I won't go into too much detail here. Perhaps we can talk about it later, but the Minister's Code really didn't make that much change, but they did highlight a misconception around building regulation. Okay. So moving on to my method, bearing that in mind, we didn't have the evidence. Vacancy was really problematised in SA, but the fine-grained data to unpick this idea that vacancy was a real problem was very thin on the ground. So the need to develop VVAM, my method, was born. So VVAM involves four stages, and pardon the pun, I'm repurposing existing, not buildings, but secondary data that's collected by other people. The tool was really intentionally developed to use non-specialist software, everyday Microsoft Excel, because university research often gets criticised for complex, inexpensive tools that are just too specialised for application in practice. So I really wanted to keep this really practical tool, really sustainable, that people could pick up on it and run with it in policy development and decision making. This diagram represents the stages from evaluating the data in stage 1 to creating the sample. Stage 3 is around visualising the vacancy before you can then use that data to evaluate vacancy, its distribution, and what we can do about it to mitigate vacancy. Okay, so the first step in the method really is to identify suitable secondary data set and look across the data to identify the variables to quantify vacancy. What's going to be possible? There's lots of data that's already collected that's sitting around councils, sitting around different organisations, and it's really about networking and getting someone on board on your research to share some data for this purpose. And then from there, when you've identified that you've got some useful variables that you can work vacancy data from, then it's about establishing a method and a formula so that you're robust when you're quantifying the different vacancy types and you're not overclaiming. As the data is being reused for a new purpose, you also need to check and have a bit of an audit to make sure that the method you're going to use, the calculations and the formula, is reliable, and the data is reliable too. So for mine, I use neighbours data to check some of the variables in my data set to make sure that I wasn't going to be wasting my research time. So this method can be applied to any different building population, not just commercial office buildings, but the research study obviously focused on office buildings. And it's subsequently been tested on a different building population of heritage buildings as well. And it gave some pretty good findings for that study also. But in my case, I created a sample of 118 non-heritage office buildings above 4-storey located in Adelaide CBD, bound by the beautiful parklands. And I use stacked bar charts within Excel to visualise vacancy and occupancy. And that's represented here, 4 different buildings. And these 4 buildings show a mixture of the different spaces. So I've got occupied office space in dark blue, untenanted vacancy in office use space in light blue. I've got grey space vacancy, a different kind of vacancy is obviously highlighted in grey. And the different purples represent the non-office space within an office building. So dark purple is occupied space and light purple is underused or vacant non-office space in an office building. And VVAM is adaptable, so you can examine other mixes of vacancy, other types of vacancy, and it's really scalable depending on the size of the building, number of floor plates, etc. So you can see here we've got building 60 with 18 stories, where building 67 has 11 stories, and it can go below basement areas as well. And each line on the bar chart represents a floor of the building. So you can locate and see patterns around the vacancy data. You can see whether, there's any problems with vacancy at high level, low level, and how it's distributed across each building, and then amplify that to the city scale. Okay, so some findings, and then I'm about to wrap up and open the floor. So what we found was that there were very few buildings, despite the high vacancy rate, very few buildings that were standing wholly empty, ready for whole building adaptive reuse. There would need to be considerable legal work to enable adaptive reuse to happen with existing tenants, with existing leases, occupying space. So with that in mind, the underuse was spread throughout the whole office building, and especially throughout the premium and high quality grades, which was pretty unexpected given the focus in public debate is always on the low grade buildings, the ones that need to transition. But actually, there is a possibility that these buildings in the premium grades, which are up to code, could be transitioned to other uses as well. And that might help reduce the vacancy rate. Now, this also challenges the sinking stack theory as well, and points to a localised problem of low demand for office space in Adelaide currently, and also a reluctance by building owners to convert to new uses. If there's low demand for office space, there's possibly low demand for other space uses as well. So that really starts to question whether adaptive reuse is the most sustainable solution. It also tallies with other qualitative data that I gathered through the semi-structured interviews. And really the building owners and developers who were active in Adelaide CBD and do get involved in adaptive reuse and other kinds of development could offer no evidence that the NCC code was a technical barrier to adaptive reuse. In fact, they said quite the opposite, that they did not have an issue with NCC challenges and compliance officers were pretty flexible. So really the take-home points for policy is that we really need a more nuanced, fine-grained understanding of vacancy, and simplistic averages across, being projected across the city are just not very useful to develop sustainable urban solutions. We also really need a realistic understanding of what adaptive reuse is capable of. And we need more progressive policy to drive urban vibrancy and not just look at adaptive reuse. We need a whole good mix of doing that, especially when we see vacancy climbing due to COVID anxiety. So the take home for practice really as well is really important. We need to have a greater emphasis on education of built environment professionals around building regulation. Now, there isn't a single textbook out there at the moment that describes building regulation in Australia for built environment professionals, and I find that quite astounding that we don't have a single academic text to do that. We also need to understand how building regulation is applied state by state to adaptive reuse, and what's the framework in the Building Acts around adaptive reuse compliant requirements. So we need to dispel negative myths around building regulation and don't be tempted to join in anti-regulation rhetoric without examining what is the evidence first for the need for a regulatory change if we don't want to risk another bonfire of regulation scenarios. So what's the problem represented to be in Adelaide? We're still, still need to look at more data to identify what the problem is, but at the moment, I think it's low demand. So how can vacancy data unpack the problem further to provide those solutions? And finally, my last slide, which is really, I want to advocate really for an epidemiological approach to understanding vacancy across cities. We've got it for COVID, we need it for tracking and tracing vacancy across the cities. And a call out really to those people who are holding data that we could come together and do some robust and transparent collection of data and analysis of data across not just Adelaide, but other cities suffering vacancies such as Perth and Darwin, and now Melbourne's joining in that mix as well. And one last slide, I cut this out for time, but I might just squeeze it in now, which is, we need to challenge that adaptive reuse is not happening, because here's 3 examples of adaptive reuse in Adelaide that have happened, and I've got many more. However, adaptive reuse that has happened is perhaps not the quality that we'd like to see. This is my favourite building in Adelaide for this reason. It's it's very creatively named Motel Adjacent Casino is its official title. If you go on Google, you can see what it's like to stay in this motel, quite entertaining read on the Google reviews. But this is an example of an SA bank that's converted to a low quality adaptive reuse hotel. Okay, I'm going to leave it there and open the floor to discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Gill. Yaara and Tyler here, your co-hosts for the day. Beautiful presentation, and as you know, it's a topic that's very close to my heart, so I'm just going to jump in with the first question based on previous conversation. After your article has been published now, has there been any take-up from other agencies? Has anyone come knocking on your door urgently going, we need this spreadsheet, there's so much we can do with it, because it is a fantastic tool?
Yeah, during the process of the research, Perth City Council Economic Development Unit were interested in doing that, and I've been trying to push it out. The article came out on Sunday, and I've had some chats to Melbourne City Council as well. So what I'd actually like to see is a dashboard across Australia as well, not just one city, but a multitude of cities, and really being transparent around, not so much publishing everything, because there's a lot of commercial sensitivity around this data, but a transparency around the vacancy data that is acceptable to release, but the method that we've used to collect it, that robustness, so that we can rely on the data and be honest and open about where the data's limitations are, what we don't know, but also what we're really confident reporting about.
Might jump on the back of that one there too, and it might be one generally for the floor itself anyway. What's people's knowledge of feasibility studies that happen before projects commence? That would be a great place to say, okay, you see this research as part of the feasibility study. It's like, okay, maybe it's not worth us actually building a new building, we can do something else. So does anyone know about how that process starts before, I guess, those of us in the industry even hear of the project commencing?
So Gill, did you want to pick that one up, or would you like me to jump in and give my personal experience?
Yeah, start off, Yaara.
So by the time we get to the table as architects, there's often already a stack of data collected and formulas kind of done in the background in terms of the money side of things. And that's unfortunate from our perspective, because once people have those numbers in their heads, it's quite hard to shift the perspective. And I think that's definitely part of the problem that Gill has identified in her research, is that people tend to go for the tried and tested formulas. They have these ways of running the numbers, and they tend to stick with them and sort of don't challenge them. I think, Gill, that was one of your takeaways from the research, wasn't it?
Mm. Yeah, and it's also about not just the stage that built environment professionals get in, but also the amount of information that's out there. Because in research, adaptive reuse research is really immature field. So when we look at sample sizes of research that is helpful for people to read about adaptive reuse, it's sample size of one paper reports one case study. And it's really hard to get a good sense of how that case study applies to your situation. We need, bigger sample sizes. We need case studies that look beyond just the one building scale, so that people can start to sign up to adaptive reuse with greater confidence much earlier on in the process.
Now, Gill, you've been invited to participate in circular economy events by Sharon. Sharon, if you want to have a chat to Gill and extend a formal invitation, we're here to facilitate.
Yeah, I just wanted to, Gill, it's the first time I've connected with you virtually, apart from over messages, but just thank you for doing this research. I mean, I literally had a conversation with a colleague of mine a couple of years ago where we were going, where is all the vacant office space in the city, all the vacant spaces and the underused spaces? And because I'd contributed to a book called Sharing Cities, and one of the sections I contributed to was housing, and looked at where councils, I think it's Camden in London, have put 150%. So it's like a tax on vacant properties, residential properties, to encourage, to incentivise. Well, instead of leaving that vacant, you can't do that because, or you're incentivised not to do that because there's an impact on the city and how the city works, or how the city functions with all those sorts of things. And I was thinking, where's the equivalent for commercial? So there's not only, you talked about the economic aspects of this. What can we do to create an economically appealing environment to not just to adaptive reuse? I mean, you talked about this whole spectrum of things that can happen, because I'm just sitting here thinking, for some years I've been looking for space for creatives, and I note just the other day, I think it was the Sydney Morning Herald coming out with, well, what can we do with all this glut of space now that COVID has kind of, created this situation that wasn't around before. Even before then, I was looking for space to support Makerspace Adelaide, just one example in Adelaide. They're a group of volunteers who are doing amazing work to create an asset for the city in Franklin Street, and they're paying commercial rent. And during COVID last year, because they don't have any paid employees, they fell through the criteria of getting rent relief and all these other things. So they were just, every which way you go, the economic and all those other barriers are there to stop great things happening. These are a group of people that have come in and done a massive amount of work improving that building. The landlord's thrilled with it, but they're paying commercial rent. So now they've got to try and earn that income. And I'm thinking, so I wrote a bit of a rant, which I'm happy to send to the group later, not my work hat on, called Slaying the Rent Dragon, and just talked about, I know there are so many people crying out for this space. They can't compete on the basis of commercial rent. So that then creates a problem if you've got, property owners or building owners that have invested in doing something, want a return on it, or, how do you make that space available? Obvious, to me, it's just pretty much philanthropy or the city decides that that's important to have in the city, so that we actually do have this diversity of use and all these interesting things going on that makes the city what it is. So that was just one battle, which I'm happy to talk to anybody about in further detail, but trying to find this space, not being able to get it, doing some internal advocacy to get my agency to fund that space, But yeah, a group of volunteers is now paying commercial rent in order to add value to the city. That just seems wrong to me. It's kind of stuck right there. And then you see all these things about how much vacant space there is, and it just makes me cry. So I'm just wondering, what is there any other models like that Camden one for residential that's happening with commercial, where you can end up utilising this space? And I don't mean Renew, Adelaide, Place, things like that. I do know of those things. They offer very short term, particularly if you want to do things with machinery that involves water or welding. You can't find a big enough space. Then if they change that on you, you've got to find a space to take all that machinery to, and it's not easy to do. So just thinking in terms of that space.
They're great starters. They're temporary adaptive reuse and pop-ups. They're really good starting positions, but you'd want the conversation to have moved on from that. And address, a lot of the creative industry are really niche things. That's their benefit. They're selling something amazing and brand new. So they're going to have different needs from retail, and they're not going to have standard needs. But there are mechanisms within Australia. Canberra's got pretty progressive policy on vacancy. They have a taxation on vacant buildings. So the policy is here, the mechanisms is here, just not in SA to do that. And there's always as soon as a stick is introduced, then there's a huge amount of pushback from different groups, because they're protecting, who they represent, and that's fair enough. But definitely the mechanisms are available. They're being used in Australia. Victoria also has a residential vacancy tax as well, but there's not a lot of revenue collected off that. So there are mechanisms there, but JLL, Property Council have also come out, and really it's a time of alignment, this big disruption that's happening now. Lots of different stakeholder groups that would normally kind of have some friction between them are coming together, and they're identifying that creative industry, people's experiences in the city is what's going to get people back in the CBDs. It's not going to be just residential or adaptive reuse for, opening up craft beer bars, etc. It's about experience. So Makerspace offers that unique experience.
Are you in contact with
sorry, Sharon, we've got time for one more question.
Oh, sorry. I'll talk to you later.
Lachlan, if you'd like to jump in and ask your question.
Oh yeah, hi everyone. I'm Lachlan. I'm in Adelaide also. I guess during COVID, there's so many empty commercial buildings now, and there's this real residential problem. I guess, how realistic is it that we can adapt these commercial buildings that are empty to residential living?
So adaptive reuse to residential has been done throughout history. The Friends sitcom really popularised the conversion of space in inner cities for residential. So it is possible. I mean, there's a huge amount of conversion in Melbourne to residential under postcode 3000. It's just whether there's a real belief by developers that nobody wants to live in the CBD. And coming from outside of Adelaide CBD is one of the most livable CBDs I have ever come across. It's got schools, it's got primary schools, high schools in the centre. Why aren't they being converted to family housing? So there's a reluctance by developers to take that risk because they believe there's no demand for residential in the CBD, but also there's a reluctance by building owners to sell buildings and a reluctance for them to transition to new markets. If they own a commercial office building, and that's really strong expertise, they're not experts in residential landlords. They don't want to transition to a completely new market. So adaptive reuse is only once, it's got its limitations really. And this over advocacy to expect every vacant building to be, to convert, yeah, sure, you can convert it, but it's around people and changing people's mindsets, not just the building. The building is a dumb thing, and you can change these buildings with a new tech, deep retrofit, upgrading them. That's possible. We know it's possible. But changing the mindset, changing the social aspect of adaptive reuse or managing buildings better, that's a different ballgame.
Exactly what we're finding is we're supply and demand, but it's becoming more popular, more sexy now to retrofit and to go down that path of adaptive reuse. So hopefully we can keep championing it and Gill, definitely your research will go a long way towards supporting that movement. And anyone else out there that wants to be part of that movement and connect and support that research, I'm pretty sure Sharley will we'll put our hand up to continue that conversation. And I think Emil from our R&D department is on this conversation back from the office in Perth, so we can continue to have these conversations across Australia and spread the word, spread the love, and make this happen. And thanks to everyone today for joining us and supporting that movement. Yes, thank you, Ken, and the guys back at D-Squared. Thank you, Sharon Lachlan, for your questions. Thanks everyone on the chat for chipping in and sharing your thoughts with us. And we'll see you around in the next event, which is, Ken?
Oh, thank you. I was about to say, before everyone totally cuts out, the ASBN is actually going to be at the home show at the Adelaide Showgrounds this weekend. So if you know anyone that needs to really have a chat about sustainability on a residential scale, we'll be there. Just like you, Sharon, just chewing people's ears off on what they should be considering and things of that nature. But we're going to have a slew of events through May and June. So make sure that you keep an ear out and connect with us on socials, or even get on our newsletter and event mail out lists. And for anyone that happens to work for a fantastic company, and I'm just putting it out there that the ASBN is going to be launching our sponsorship drive next week. So if you want to give us money, do so. Sorry, commercial. But yeah, we got bills to pay too. Yeah.
Yeah, help get your name out there as well, guys.
And thank you so much, Gill. Like, amazing, really, really amazing thoughts. And yeah, a lot to think about. And I really appreciate, just like I'm just echoing Yaara and Tyler, but I really appreciate you putting this out so we can actually have these conversations and have, like you said, data-driven decision-making. It's so important. So thank you so much for doing this work and connecting with our community with these thoughts and research.
No, it was all, you guys have been so supportive. It was only right that I give the first presentation back in Adelaide. Thank you.
We're breaking news.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Gill. Thanks, team.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.